The 6th of June 1944, D-Day. It was one of the most important and pivotal military operations of the Second World War, as the Allies would land in Normandy and try to take a foothold in Europe. The plan was to get off the beaches as soon as possible and to destroy the emplacements that the Germans had, and within days the Allies wanted to liberate many of the towns and villages around the Normandy coast. The different beaches had different levels of resistance, with Omaha being the deadliest. But despite the Normandy landings being seen as a huge success and a victory, which turned the war for the Allies, there was a huge military cost. Men were mown down by machine gun fire as soon as the ramps of the landing craft were dropped, and it was slaughter on a huge scale. Thousands of men would lay their lives down, but what is not as well known is the operations following the landings to clean up the bodies of those Allied soldiers who died on the beaches. The sea in places was turned red with the horror, but join us today as we look at what happened to the dead bodies of D-Day. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. The plans for D-Day had been in place for years, and following the retreat from Dunkirk, the Allies knew that they would need to go and try and take a foothold in Europe. In the years in between, the RAF had defeated the Luftwaffe in the Battle of Britain, but eventually in 1944, the decision was made for the Allies to go back to Europe to retake France. It's estimated that 160,000 soldiers landed on the 5 beaches of Omaha, Gold, Sword, Juneau and Utah. The American soldiers landed at the beaches codenamed Omaha and Utah, and the German resistance here was rather brutal and intense. The terrain and also the weather made things more difficult, and many soldiers had to wade through water whilst the Germans fired their machine guns at them. But many different men would fall in the landings, and the men had to leave their fallen comrades behind, as they had to get off the beachhead as soon as possible. Despite being incredibly organised, the Allies probably did not anticipate the resistance and experience that the soldiers would face when they landed, and it was very chaotic. Eisenhower had been told before that he should expect the majority of the 150,000 soldiers to die in the attempts to regain Normandy, and he was told that the paratroop landing would bring a 75% death rate. It's not entirely known the exact numbers of men that died on the beaches, but most memorials claim that there were around 4,414 Allied deaths at least, with the most deadly beach being Omaha with 2,000 American soldiers dying there. On other beaches, 2,000 British soldiers were killed, and 340 Canadians were also killed. The Germans lost around 4,000 to 9,000 men in the operation, but most of these men today have been laid to rest inside the various military cemeteries in Normandy, but this was not the case on D-Day. As the soldiers were occupied pushing towards the ridges and the bunkers, the dying soldiers were often left to succumb to their fate. Medics were struggling to cope with the huge number of casualties, and the ones who survived had nothing else on their mind than to push forward and get out of the way of the heavy fire. No one expected these men to be tending to the dead in these moments, and they certainly did not expect them to inter the dead in graves whilst they were being shot at. Some soldiers who saw people dying did offer a slight bit of comfort to them if they had shelter from the fire, but some would see a dead body and then cover their remains with a blanket or a cloth, or anything they had on them, and then they moved on. A number of soldiers would recount how, as they were taken onto the beach, there were the floating remains of fallen soldiers in the water, as the waves were bringing them back and then washing them back on the shore. Some soldiers had to crawl on top of those who were floating and were lying on the beach. There are many famous images of the bodies scattered all over Omaha and the various other beaches too, but the first wave of landing soldiers would say the remains were scattered across the sand. There were some medics and men who were on ships that would receive the wounded and dead soldiers who had been pulled onto the boats. When the landing craft got back, some of the landing craft were carrying the remains of those who had been killed by German bullets, and they hadn't even disembarked the ships. Those who were in the next wave could see this and would be shocked, but as the Allies took control of the German positions and took control of the beaches, they were tasked with moving further into France and pushing on. They were still not in the business of dealing with the dead who were on the beaches, but behind them were the bodies of thousands of comrades. The decision was made to temporarily inter the bodies in a graveyard, as leaving them in the open was said to have been distasteful and too hard for the backup soldiers to see. Also for sanitation and hygiene reasons, the bodies needed dealing with rather quickly. One man, Sergeant Albert E. Legg, decided for one temporary gravesite. and he would use whatever tools he had to bury the dead, often on the beaches. The graves were then marked with wooden debris. When they came across paratroopers who had been killed, they marked the parachutists with their parachutes, using them as shrouds to wrap the bodies. Often soldiers would recount that the Allies, following establishing a front, would work quickly to bury the remains of the fallen, as it was the start of June, and the decomposition of the bodies would be happening very quickly. Trailers were offloaded from landing craft to carry the dead, and to then take them to the burial grounds off the beachhead and nearby. Within 4 days, the Allies had established 8 military cemeteries in the areas surrounding the beaches. And a month after D-Day, it's believed that these cemeteries held the remains of more than 30,000 soldiers who had been killed. The Quartermaster Graves Registration Service also emerged, and this was an attempt by the Americans to identify the bodies of the fallen using their dog tags, and they would then process the dead and then inter them in the graves. There were many grave registration companies and groups set up by the different armies, and they had been trained in many different practices, to organising burial grounds, to watching autopsies. But many of the men, despite their hardy training, had not been prepared for the actual act of dealing with the dead. Identifying the remains of those soldiers who were killed on the D-Day beaches was varied, as it could be as easy as using the metal dog tag around their necks, but often there were more complex identification methods used. The standard working way was to bury the bodies and to bury the remains with one dog tag, while sending the other back for registration purposes, so that families could later be notified. But the chaotic nature of the beaches and the horror of the slaughter often led to the bodies being found without dog tags, or sometimes these were broken. The men who were there to recover the dead also had to often wade through the water and the sea to collect the remains of those who had died. Some soldiers even had to exhume those who had died inside of sunken craft or vehicles, and some people had to be collected by divers. One private would note how one of his worst experiences was having to free the remains of a fallen soldier who had become tangled in the propellers of a landing craft. But the sanitation for those who buried the dead was not great, and the Germans would also place booby traps on the dead during the war, so this was another hazard that the men had to deal with. But captured on the D-Day beaches were a number of German prisoners of war, and these men were then ordered to help deal with the dead. Some captured soldiers were forced to work as gravediggers in a cemetery, and many of them did freak out, as they believed that the graves they were digging were for them, like the German practice of executing prisoners who would be forced to dig their graves first. Local civilians also helped to bury, and the French were also paid to do this. But still today there are a number of Allied men who have not been identified. The exact number of the dead on the 6th of June 1944 is unknown, due to the chaos that did happen. Some were not killed on the beaches, for example in the parachute landing of D-Day, and for this it's difficult to calculate an exact death toll. Some soldiers went missing and no remains were found. But following the war there were many soldiers who remained in military cemeteries in Europe, far from their homelands. Many families did not want to exhume their beloved sons and fathers, and repatriating them back to America and other countries was by some considered too difficult and too costly. But others did want to bring the dead of D-Day home, and the American government would set aside millions to repatriate. In total, over $1.5 billion was spent bringing the D-Day fallen back to America, but more than 171,000 fallen soldiers from America by 1951 had been returned to their homes and families. But the dead of D-Day to begin with were left behind by those men whose primary objective it was to get off the beaches. The clean-up operation fell to those who were in the latter stages of the advancement, and they were then tasked with burying those on the beaches who had been killed. Still today there are men who gave their lives for the freeing of occupied Europe, who lie in graveyards and have not yet been identified. There are still men who are missing, and there are still fallen soldiers who lie on the battlefields of Europe. This is the same for the First World War, over a century on, but despite D-Day being seen as a heroic day, there was a huge cost to the lives of the military, and we must never forget those who gave their lives to ridding Europe from evil. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.